has to emerge in a single kind of identity almost.
Recently, I had an artist on the podcast who was discussing how it's nice not to provide all the answers, right? That the work
Exactly.
needs to, in some way, be open-ended. And I've heard you
Mm-hmm.
say before, as an artist, you're trying to resist collapsing into certainty, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
can you kind of talk about that, where you're pursuing like chance and entropy and chaos, but as an artist, can you talk about the ability to leave things open-ended?
Yeah, it's a sweet spot, right, between control and chaos. If it's completely, if you set two kind of fields like a Venn diagram or something, and you have complete chaos on one side, then we all know what that kind of looks like. I did a series of nature paintings that were just kind of poured chemical reactions that mimic nature, and that's fine. And they're very beautiful, and nature does its thing. And then on the other side, you can have something that's incredibly rigorous and worked out. But I guess the best analogy is something like gardening, where you want the thing to be wild but somehow controlled, and it all happens on that periphery between those two edges. It's the edge between control and chaos, where in a fractal you get all the interesting stuff happening, and so your practice is kind of you go into this place with quite a rigorous system, and you're hoping for these sort of miniature moments of enlightenment to occur or something, or happy accidents, and you follow those channels, and you work laterally unless you've got a deadline, like an exhibition or something, and then suddenly you go really vertically to finish everything. And I guess it's a dance with those kind of elements, and trying to elicit that kind of texture from it, and you know it when you see it. Something that's been really labored, or something that's you can't. You often, I think the ones that when I think they're most successful, I can't work out how I've done them, and neither can anyone else.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell me about the studio wall drawings. When did that start?
That started around 97. But I was doing them before. I had a very small studio in Bermondsey in South London, and it only had a tiny window, which I know exactly, it was 126 centimeters wide. So I had a ream of paper made to that size, and I just have it pinned up, and I would put phone numbers on it just with a kind of magic marker, and ideas and scribbles. Um, Sometimes draw something, paint something out. It was just a bit like a whiteboard, but it was a red brick building and no heating, as I remember. And I would, when they got so full that you couldn't see anything, I'd peel them off and just pile them up like carpets in the corner. And it was my first art dealer, Anthony Reynolds, came around one day, and he was like, "These are great," and I didn't even think of them as artworks. I just thought them as kind of doodle pads. And from that, they kind of developed, and they began to become more like a kind of visual diary, became a little more poetic. And then they sort of, as they built and as they sort of expanded, it became this kind of kind of recorded history of the time that passes and the changes that go on, really.
You currently have a show up at Hauser Wirth that has the studio wall drawings. And when we go in there and see those images, they're kind of compiled into a grid. They all look like siblings, but no two look alike. There's typically a date in some sort of text. Are those individual works executed in a day, or is the concept found in a day and executed later?
Yeah, I get the question. I mean, the dates refer to the event usually that's triggered them,
Got it.
or if it's more of a process, it could be the moment that drawing was finished. But in terms of the time it takes to do them, they range from 20 minutes through to 6 months. And of course, you're doing more than one simultaneously if there's some ones that take longer. And I think, as it developed, I got to the point of thinking about, the idea of self, and how the different kind of modalities you have as a human being. Sometimes you're very philosophical. and thinking artistically. Other times you're physical, sexual, you're vegging out, watching TV, and so on. And so that diversity of Mark finding the correct approach for the mood you're in, for the event that's going on in the world. And of course, those events we all share, but we interpret in different ways. And I think what happens is when I arrange them in a non-chronological grid, because there's a point, this is this emergence idea again, when you get enough of them, it has a critical mass, and you get this sense of it being bigger than an individual's idea. Because when I first started the one in Hauser Wirth, I remember it was like 20 minutes past midnight on the first of the millennium. And I did I was a bit drunk, obviously, and I did a painting of...
well, we were all worried about the Y2K bug back then too, right?
Well, once we'd survived that, I got the paints out. And I painted a sort of cloudscape with potential in the day and just wondered what would happen. And I think looking at that now, and I look back, of course, the iPhone hadn't been invented. Instagram didn't exist, but they were in a portrait format just by coincidence, almost exactly the same format as an iPhone or something. And now, of course, everybody's got walls posting their daily sort of thoughts on whatever they managed to snap or create. But back then, it seemed like quite a trivial thing to be making art about, like very trivial activity, and didn't even seem as sort of serious as someone like Onkayawara, who had a very rigid conceptual structure that made it look serious. It seemed a little ephemeral, But when you put them together, I think there's something there that's kind of interesting. And it was very important. I used to sell them individually, and I think they really lose their context when you just see one on its own. It really needs the others, its siblings, as you call it, to get a sense of what it's about.
It seems like everything you do in your work serves as some sort of allegory or metaphor for the real world. And, you think about any one of us, you meet somebody and you have one impression of them. And then when you meet them as they're interacting with their family, and you understand them totally differently as part of this group that you would never realize.
Like teenagers meeting their parents, there's that collisions of planets, that shouldn't ever be.
I've always found things like weddings to be incredibly surreal, because it's these different, all of your personal universes that you have kept siloed wind up interacting, and you can't stop your crazy uncle from talking to the guy in your office, and again, chaos ensues, right?
Yeah, and we also we betray ourselves in a way that we've got our idea of ourselves, which is one thing, and then we've got our shadow side, and we've got the stuff we don't want to look at, and we've got all sorts of founding singularities for the way we behave. I mean, that's the history of therapy, uncovering that stuff, right? So this is what I was saying earlier. You're not the best judge of your own output. I know so many artists that tell me what their work's about, and I love their work, and I think you're wrong. That's absolutely not what your work's about. But if that's the engine they're using to create this great stuff, so be it. And I just think it's just an interesting activity for me to be involved in, and I think the dates we all share in common. I don't think it could look a little grandiose if you go in there and you're like, oh, look at Keith's amazing mind jumping from here to here and here, and that's really certainly not my intention. I believe we all carry this huge mass of studio wall drawings inside us. We all have that kind of montage that you're going to see at the end of your life, to use the cliche of these moments. And it's more to sort of really, again, that texture of complexity, the sort of miracle of the everyday I'm trying to kind of depict. And those dates we all share, September the 11th, the various things that go on in the world. Journalists will talk about them one way, politicians will talk about them another way. Your subconscious, or the poetic way of looking at it, or the could be something very simple. You can be political in different ways. For instance, after the Twin Towers come down, you could argue you could have a piece that's very political about what caused that event. But somebody who paints a vase of flowers the next day, who was in the shadow of that, is making a political statement about choosing life. And that's the thing about art. It's open to interpretation. You can't control the way things are seen. Events have happened in the space of that show with the Ukraine, for instance, that have changed a couple of those drawings, and their meaning is incredibly different to when even though they were painted 10 years ago, because they have the same colors as the Ukrainian flag, and the title of one of them is the distribution of bodies in space. It suddenly has this interpretation of refugees or something. But that's just because how the moment in which something's seen and the moment in which something's made, they connect, and sort of time is very important metric in the observation of art. Sorry, I went off on one there, but I was riffing on the idea of it.
No, that's great. I mean, I think what we're establishing here is that you think deeply, and you're pursuing. It's almost like you're pursuing some form of truth through the exploration of chaos, and your work really seems like a microcosm of the universe, right?
Well, I think everybody's work is, though, to some extent. I think there's nobody out there that makes work without rules, even if those rules are, I'm going to improvise and be kind of do jazz. But the idea of practice in a sort of Buddhist sense, that's where it begins to connect with something perhaps deeper, because you're doing something and you kind of don't know what you're doing in a knowing way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you're right in that's another conversation that came up recently, is if artists are challenged to be rule breakers, why do we still find ourselves tied to certain preconceptions about what's considered a painting, or what the form factor should be, or the materiality? Can we get past, the question of, do you paint in oil or acrylic, right? I mean, it's...
yeah, that seems odd to be stuck there.
Right.
But, you've got two things here as well. You've got art, or creativity, let's call it creativity. And then you've got something, for want of a better word, like the art market or branding or museum, the exposure of what you do, and the level of that exposure, the context in which it goes. And they all have their own criterion, right? So you can do anything you want, is the fact. But if you want to be an audience, if you want people to engage with what you're doing, or you want to, inspire someone or something, then there are rules to be broken. And that's another dance that artists have done forever, right? Dealt with those two things.
That reminds me of a conversation I had one time with a pretty successful artist, had some museum shows and whatnot. And I went to a gallery show, and I was asking him about the work at this particular gallery show, and he was telling me, oh, well, this isn't my serious work. This is the work that, the people want to put on the walls of their home. And then it was almost like he had two bodies. It's like he had the large, serious stuff that he knew, would be attractive to institutions, and he had the beautiful things that he knew people would want to buy and put on their walls. And I don't know how many artists actually think that way, but I thought that was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I noticed when I used to teach. I would have students come up to me and they say, "This is the stuff I'm doing for the course, and this is the stuff I do because I like doing it," or something. And the challenge was always to amalgamate those two ideas, those two motivating strands. But look, we're all fallible human beings, and we all have a need for validation. And I think it's a constant battle to try and, this idea of branding is something that, I've always rubbed up against, and the idea of the masterpiece and all that kind of thing. I'm not a great believer in that kind of connoisseurship. I believe that you can see things and say they're particularly beautiful. But I do think, I was guilty of that early on, like when galleries were advising me and collectors were interested in one thing rather than another, and I had overheads. I didn't have any